Well, hi again, everybody. Welcome back. Today's lesson is a good one. It's one I've been waiting a long time for. Today we have with us Vince Guerrieri. He is a Cleveland-based journalist and historian. He is the co-author of Ohio Sports Trivia. He is the author of The Blue Streaks and Little Giants. And his work has appeared in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, the Fremont News-Messenger, the Elyria Chronicle-Telegram, Popular Mechanics, Deadspin, Ohio Magazine, Cleveland Magazine, Jalopnik, and my personal favorite, the BG News, which is where we met. And Vince is probably one of my best buddies on planet Earth. So, Vince, welcome to Toledo Past, Present, Future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kind words.
Well, I appreciate your time today.
Where else would I be? Besides, I get to show off the intellectual splendor of my new home office, which
there you go.
4,500 square feet.
Beautiful.
So,
well, let me. Go ahead.
To talk about Dempsey and Willard.
We are going to talk about the Dempsey Willard fight. So let me bring up your presentation here.
All right. Obviously, this presentation I did summer of 2019 for the centennial of the Dempsey Willard heavyweight championship fight, which was in Toledo on the 4th of July, 1919. I also wrote a piece about that for Deadspin, and it was just generally a wild time in Toledo. And let's get started. Obviously, as you've heard time and time again, you will do better in Toledo. And that was definitely the case as the 20th century started. Toledo was the third largest city in Ohio. It even surpassed Columbus. Then as now, it was home to a lot of manufacturing and factories and auto industry and auto parts. Obviously, it had by then acquired its reputation as the Glass City, home to Libby Glass. And because it had a wide variety of factories and plants and places to work, it drew a lot of immigrants who were coming to the United States from various places throughout Europe. And let's go to the next slide. And those immigrants brought with them their own traditions and ways of life, and that includes great food, and that includes fun holiday traditions. But not all of the traditions were good. There was an organization, sort of the proto-mafia, called the Black Hand, and they would extort Italian businessmen, and do that with threats to back them up. One of the things that the work in Toledo afforded people was disposable income. For the first time, there were a lot of people who might have had a few extra bucks to spend. And with that, they might not necessarily spend it on things that were above board. They might schedule for a little bit of female companionship. They might go out and have a few drinks someplace that didn't necessarily have a license. They might play a crap game. They might play a card game. And at that point, there were certain elements that were very interested in righting the ship and leading the straight and narrow, but there were certain elements that were more than willing to take whatever tribute they could get for political favors.
And I'll use that as a launch point for you. If you guys love that story, you're going to love the next video that you watch when we get into Gangland Toledo.
I'm excited about that too. Next slide. One of the things that people started to do with their disposable income is attend spectator sporting events that they would go and watch other people play sports. Pro baseball started in 1869 in Cincinnati with the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Shortly thereafter, there was a professional team in Cleveland as well, the Forest Cities. And there is obviously all kinds of professional teams started up. At the same time, colleges started playing football. The first collegiate football game was, I believe, Rutgers and Princeton. And obviously it was popular on the college level. It soon became popular on the high school level as well. The problem with football is that it carried with it a certain element of danger. And we'll go into that in a little more on the next slide. Football was actually hazardous to your health, and not in the sense that it is now, where you had to worry about long-term brain damage. There were people who were getting killed on the field because of offensive formations like the flying wedge, where people would basically lock arms and run down the field and run over everybody that was in their path.
I'd love to see Tom Brady dodge that, frankly.
Right, obviously. Theodore Roosevelt, who's shown here in this picture, saw value in physical fitness. He saw value in strenuous sports like football, like boxing, like various other things, because it had worked for him. It had helped him grow from a relatively sickly child into a robust man. And one of the things that he did was he got together the presidents and athletic administrators from a lot of colleges on the East Coast, and created the NCAA, and which was tasked with finding rules to make the game safer. And one of the initial things that they did was they changed the rules to allow for what was called the forward pass, that you could advance the ball by throwing it to somebody downfield. And the first NCAA player to throw a forward pass was a guy named Bradbury Robinson from St. Louis University. And he was actually a native of Bellevue, Ohio. As I said, Teddy Roosevelt was a boxer. He enjoyed the sport very much. There were a lot of people who enjoyed the sport very much. It was used as a fitness regimen in a lot of the armed forces. But while boxing was seen as good exercise, prize fighting was seen as an illicit activity, peopled by gangsters and other unsavory characters, to the point where it was made illegal in certain places. Next slide.
Vince, is it fair to say that it's almost like I mean, obviously they didn't have the kayfabe, that the prize fighting was real boxing, but was the public perception almost like the difference between collegiate or high school wrestling and pro wrestling today, or am I off base on that?
The comparison that I would draw is the reaction to boxing at that point was similar to the reaction that you would see it to mixed martial arts about 10 or 15 years ago. It was viewed as an unsavory, uncivilized blood sport.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me.
And one of the practitioners of prize fighting was Jess Willard. He was an enormous man. I believe he was 6'7". They said he was the tallest heavyweight champion, I think, until Klitschko won the title about 15 years ago. And like I said, one of the risks with football is that people died on the field, and one of the risks of boxing is that people die in the ring. And Jess Willard actually had killed somebody in the ring, Jack Bull Young, in 1913. This picture is taken of Jess Willard defeating Jack Johnson in Havana. Jack Johnson, of course, was the first African-American heavyweight champion, and he was, along with the natural savagery that boxing elicited in other people, there was obviously an element of racism with the distaste that they had for Jack Johnson. And Willard was the first of, what was referred to for generations as the Great White Hope, the white man who could beat the dangerous black man. Johnson actually lost the fight, I believe it was in 23 rounds. There was no limit on how long prize fights could go at that point. And there were rumors that he had taken a dive. And he said, if I had taken a dive, I would have done it well before the 23rd round. Jack Johnson, of course, later went on to be played. A character based on Jack Johnson was played by James Earl Jones in The Great White Hope. And Jack Johnson, at the behest of Sylvester Stallone, this is completely true, Donald Trump granted Jack Johnson a posthumous pardon for his own federal violations. I believe they said he was in violation of the Mann,
yeah,
which made illegal the transport of women across state lines for immoral purposes. But Jess Willard agreed in 1916 to a fight promoted by a guy by the name of Tex Rickard, who is another fantastic character, and we'll get to him on this next slide. He was a Kansas native. He actually grew up, his family's farm was next to the James's farm, as in Frank and Jesse. And it might be hyperbole to say he grew up, Tex Rickard was born in a hail of gunfire, but not by much. The James gang had just robbed a bank and was fighting off a posse. Tex Rickard, he got married young, and he and his wife had a child, and the child died shortly after it was born, and his wife ended up dying a little after that, and there was nothing left tying him to the area. So he went to Alaska to try and get rich. And he made a decent living. I mean, he didn't find a fortune, but he went to Nevada, where there was also a very lucrative mining community, and he got into fight promoting. He actually promoted Jack Johnson's fight against James Jeffries, which was moved from California to Reno, Nevada, due to state opposition. And again, this is another example of how there were a lot of people who were just aghast at the idea of boxing. And let's go to the next slide. Rickard was looking for a challenger for Jess Willard, who was the heavyweight champion. And he found a guy by the name of William Harrison Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey was native of Colorado. In fact, he was a native of a town called Manassas, which led to his nickname, the Manassas Mauler. He was an itinerant boxer. He would box in mining camps, and he would walk into saloons, and he'd say, I can't sing, I can't dance, but I'll lick anyone in the house. Apparently, that was a line that James Jeffries had used previously. And he knocked around for a little while, went to New York, tried to do some boxing, but he said he was kind of shut out of all the major venues because he refused to take a dive. And so he ended up back in San Francisco, where he intervened in a bar fight. And the guy that was going to get beat up was a fellow by the name of Doc Kearns, who ended up becoming Jack Dempsey's manager. And again, Joe, you talked about the concept of the kayfabe and the heel turns. In this fight, Willard was shaping up to be the heel because he did not fight in World War I, and there were a lot of people who said that he ducked his responsibility to serve in the armed forces or do something relevant to the defense of the United States. So he was kind of set up as the villain in this. Let's go to the next slide. And so how did this fight end up in Toledo? Well, obviously, Tex Rickard wanted to have it somewhere on the East Coast because that's where all the major population was, but he couldn't have it in New York. They couldn't even sign the papers for the fight in New York. They had to go over to Weehawken, New Jersey. And if you've ever seen Hamilton, you know that all kinds of illegal stuff goes on in Weehawken. So that's where they signed the contract for the fight. They thought about having it in Europe, but Europe had just gotten over World War I. And so, I mean, nobody had any real appetite for the savagery of a prize fight. Addison Q. Thatcher, who would go on to be mayor of Toledo in the 1920s, said, why don't you have the fight in Toledo? And he had enough juice to make it happen. He said, who do we have to pay off? And they said, you don't have to pay off anybody. Just make sure that we get 7% to the mayor's charity fund, and we'll make sure that Governor Cox is okay with it. And to have this fight in Toledo, they had to find a venue for it. At that time, the Mud Hens were playing at Swain Field, which is, where is that, Joe? That's off of Monroe Street.
That's it. Detroit and Monroe. There's Swain Field Shopping Center there with a McDonald's. It's over across from Boys and Girls Club.
Sure, but that was a very small venue, and they were looking for something bigger. And so they put up a temporary stadium at Bayview Park, where the river dumped out into the lake. And if you see in this picture here, it looks kind of like a big spider web. And they originally thought that it would accommodate 40,000 people, but early ticket sales were so brisk that they doubled the size of it to 80,000. And this is before most really big venues. I mean, Yankee Stadium was still, 4 years away. The Rose Bowl wasn't the Rose Bowl like we know it. Ohio Stadium in Columbus was still under construction. So this was, for a brief moment, the largest stadium in the United States, and I think one of the largest in the world. So let's
And
go.
let me place this for the students. This stadium was basically where Manhattan Boulevard dumps out into Summit Street. And if you know where the water treatment plant is on Summer Street and the Bayview Retirees Golf Course, it was on that plot of land right there is where they built this giant stadium right off of Summit. So you guys can see the river at the top of that picture, and then at the back end down here would be Summit Street out there somewhere.
Now, as an aside, this all happened. I mentioned Yankee Stadium, but this was all going on while there was a building boom for stadiums. The biggest spectator sport in America was professional baseball. And college football was a big deal. Pro football, not so much. At this point, this was even before the NFL was founded. The NFL, what was called the Association, the American Pro Football Association, was formed in 1920 in a Hupmobile dealership in Canton. And there were a lot of professional and semi-pro teams in Ohio that were involved, but in general, pro football was kind of an afterthought compared to college football. And as a result, they needed not just a large venue for this boxing match, but a specific venue for a boxing match. And what they ended up doing is, if you remember the previous slide, it was, they had the ring in the center, and they just had these bleachers radiating out from it. Let's go to the next slide. Ultimately, the crowd was not what they had expected for this, but there were a lot of really important people who were there who mattered. At the time, the world really stopped on a dime for a heavyweight prize fight, so it was very well represented within the sporting press. This is a picture of Damon Runyon, and if you've heard of Damon Runyon, it is probably because the stories he wrote became the inspiration for Guys and Dolls. But he was a prolific writer at the time. He was a sports columnist. He covered murder trials. He was one of the titans of journalism. Also at the fight would be Grantland Rice, who of course was the namesake for the website of the same name, which came and went. Ring Lardner, basically anyone who was anyone in sports media. It also drew a great crowd of actors. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and his brother-in-law made the trip in. Charlie Chaplin bought a block of tickets, and Ethel Barrymore was there, of the famed Barrymore stage and screen family. She was actually sitting in the special ladies section of the stadium, which was cordoned off from everyone else with chain link fencing. It was estimated that more than $2 million was bet on the fight, including by some of the sports writers, and various organized crime figures attended. Damon Runyon was the subject of a biography by Jimmy Breslin about 25 years ago. And in it, Breslin said that the Roaring 20 started in Toledo in 1919 with this fight. And he told a story that there were three guys. There was a guy who wanted to meet with the fight judges. And he met with the fight judges. And he said, here's a little something for your trouble. And he left, and somebody said to the judges, did you know that was Al Capone? And they said, well, of course. I mean, we wouldn't take money from a stranger.
And that you guys can read about in a book I've mentioned a couple times in here, Forgotten Visitors to Northwest Ohio by Ted Long, which has a little bit more of the Al Capone at the Dempsey Willard fight story.
Sweet. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Yep.
We'll talk about the fight itself. All right, now we'll talk about the fight itself. And like most fights between two guys who haven't seen each other before, they come out and they dance around a little bit and they parry and they thrust. And then Dempsey came on swinging. And he beat the tar out of Willard. I mean, I knocked him down, I want to say 5 or 6 times in the first round. And everybody thought that the fight was over after one round. And in fact, I believe it was, I can't remember if it was the Times or the News Beat, but one of the newspapers in Toledo because that was the only way people got their daily news, actually went and put out an extra edition that said Dempsey had won the fight in 1 round. Well, what happened was Dempsey, Willard was down to a 7 count, and the bell rang, but nobody heard the bell ring because it malfunctioned. And Doc Kearns was ushering Dempsey out of the ring, and he thought that he had won, and he thought that Kearns had won a big payout on the $20,000 that they had put on the fight out of Dempsey's purse. And then they said, "Oh, by the way, you got to come back in." And so they brought him back in, and the fight ended up going 3 rounds, and it was, it was just more of the same. Willard was beaten bloody and refused, and they just threw in the towel so he wouldn't come out for the 4th round. Let's go to the next.
One of the things real quick with this photograph, we obviously know that from what you've said that Dempsey is a smaller guy, but is it worth noting? Do you feel that there's a little bit of perspective from the camera that makes it look a little more mismatched, or are we really looking at the height differential here?
No, that's about it. I mean,
okay.
Willard had more than 6 inches on Dempsey, and there were legitimate concerns. Like I said, Willard had already killed 1 man in the ring, and they were afraid that Dempsey was so small that he might make it too.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, next slide. Here you go.
And like I said, there was a newspaper that actually said that the fight was over in 1 round, an extra edition, because at that point newspapers were pretty much the primary, if not only, method to hear results like this. Sports on the radio was still 2 years away. It would be more than a year before KDKA went on the air in Pittsburgh and started with election returns from the Harding-Cox election in 1920. Obviously, they did have film at the time, and they did record the fight, and they tried to show it locally at the Alhambra Theater, but it was banned by censors because of how savage it was.
Wow.
And let's go to the next one. The fight was a success, but not a smashing success. Tex Rickard had made money off the fight. Jess Willard made money off the fight. Jack Dempsey made money off the fight, but nobody made an inordinate amount of money. But the fight really vaulted Rickard into that upper echelon of top boxing promoters. And I want to say a year later, maybe a little longer than that, Dempsey fought Georges Carpentier, who is a French guy, this time in New Jersey at Boyles Acres. And
all right.
They built the same kind of stadium that with the ring in the center and the stands radiating out. And that's where they got the crowd they wanted. That's where they got the gate they wanted. And I neglected to mention this, but the wood that they used to build the arena for the Dempsey Willard fight, they ended up selling off to local businesses, and they used it for framing for buildings. So it went, it was a temporary facility that everybody knew was going to be a temporary facility. Let's go to the next slide. Jack Dempsey ends up fighting Gene Tunney, and that was at Rickard's behest. Doc Kearns wanted him to fight, wanted him to go in a different direction. And that was one of the reasons that Dempsey and Doc Kearns ultimately parted ways. The first fight was at Sesquicentennial Stadium in Philadelphia, later known as John F. Kennedy Stadium. It was most famous as the venue where the Army-Navy game was played, really until the vet was built in the 70s. The fight was at night under the lights, and it was more than a decade before Major League Baseball played its first night game. And Tunney won on points. That was the first time that the heavyweight title changed hands because of a decision. And with a fight like that, I mean, just like Rocky, you got to have a sequel. So let's go to the next slide. Dempsey Tunney 2 was 364 days later at Soldier Field in Chicago, which had been built recently as a tribute to those who had fought in World War One. That fight was where the infamous long count happened. The rule in boxing is that when your opponent goes down, you're supposed to retreat to a neutral corner. Dempsey did not do that. Dempsey always stood over the people that he had vanquished. And as a result, in this instance, the referee didn't start counting until Dempsey had been moved to another corner. And so Tunney benefited from that in his recovery time and ended up beating Dempsey again. And Dempsey decided to retire at that point, and he was described by Shirley Povich of the Washington Post as the loser yet the hero. He had undergone complete rehabilitation from the draft dodger who they were afraid was going to get killed in the ring to one of the most famous and really one of the most beloved athletes of the era. Let's go to the next slide. Dempsey decided to join Rickard in fight promoting. And they had gone down to Florida at this point to try and make arrangements for some more fights. Rickard at this point was a smashing success. I mean, he was the most famous fight promoter in the world. And when they built the new Madison Square Garden, which is actually at this point the old Madison Square Garden, I believe the current Madison Square Garden is Madison Square Garden number 4. And they built number 3 in the 20s, and they gave Rickard the exclusive rights to promote all the events there.
And number 3, Madison Square Garden 3, a lot of you guys have seen the movie Cinderella Man. That's the one that is purported to be in Cinderella Man, is that MSG.
Right. And at the time, there was a hockey team in New York called the New York Americans. And Tex Rickard says, well, they seem to be doing all right. We can do great with a hockey team in Madison Square Garden. And they got a team in Madison Square Garden, and they called them Texas Rangers. And that's why the New York NHL team is the Rangers. So Tex and Jack Dempsey go down to Florida, and Tex has what he thinks is indigestion that turned out to be an inflamed appendix. And, the 20s being what they were, it killed him. And so they brought his body back up to New York, up to the train station, took it down to Madison Square Garden in front of a crowd of thousands. And they had this enormous funeral with a priest, a Baptist preacher, an Episcopalian minister, and a Jewish judge, just to make sure all the bases were covered for him. But as Dempsey said in his autobiography, it didn't matter whether Tex was going to heaven or hell. He would end up promoting something between both sides. Let's go to the next slide. Willard, for all intents and purposes, retired after the Dempsey fight. He ended up holding on to a series of jobs. Ended up in California. Had some movie roles, and he died in 1968. He was relatively obscure at that point. He had been an ex-boxer for more than 50 years. At the time, he was actually the oldest. He had the longest life of any heavyweight champion. Let's go to the next slide. Dempsey, on the other hand, opened a restaurant in New York City. If you've seen The Godfather, when Michael goes to meet Captain McCluskey and the Turk, they pick him up in front of Jack Dempsey's restaurant. This picture, which now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian, was commissioned for the restaurant. And once the restaurant closed, it ended up donated to the Smithsonian. Among his proteges was future Watergate judge John Sirica. Dempsey had taken a role in promoting some boxing in Washington, D.C., and Sirica was an amateur boxer, and they were friends for years after that. Dempsey joined the reserves in World War II. Obviously, he was of an age where he probably wouldn't have been much good in the fight, but he was able to do his part for the war effort. And then after that, he helped start a relief fund for Joe Louis. Joe Louis was a heavyweight champion in the 30s, and I think he held the belt into the 50s. And he ended up with all kinds of tax bills and other money problems, and it got to a point where he kind of relied on the help of other people. He had a token job at one of the casinos in Las Vegas, and actually at one point Frank Sinatra had stepped in and paid for his health bills. Let's go to the next. Doc Kearns died in 1962, and he wrote an autobiography that was released posthumously, and it was excerpted in Sports Illustrated. You can see the cover photo, the cover of that issue. And Kearns alleged that Dempsey's gloves were filled with plaster of Paris, and he essentially, the beating that he put on Willard, he did with loaded gloves. And Dempsey sued for libel, and he had a lot on his side. I mean, somebody actually still had the old gloves, and they said, no, there was no way there was any plaster of Paris put in here. Everybody else in that corner said there was no way that could have happened. And the allegations were proven to be unfounded, and Sports Illustrated later ran a full-page apology. And Dempsey ended up retiring, selling the restaurant and closing up shop, and he died in I want to say 1987, and that is pretty much my presentation.
Fantastic. So I'm sure there will be questions, and I'll email you questions if you get a chance to email back.
That'll be fine.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I think this is going to be a welcome change from them having to listen to me all the time.
So what is the video that you alluded to about crime and calamity?
I'm going to stop the record real quick.
Okay.